Welcome to 21st Sports Recap and Reaction for the Minnesota Vikings at the Green Bay Packers in their Week 17 matchup played January 3rd, 2016, as these two NFC North Division rivals went at it on Sunday Night Football with the division title on the line. The difference being who would host a playoff game in Wild Card Weekend and who would be on the road. So the Vikings would get the ball first. They picked up a couple of first downs. They were then faced with a 4th and 3 on their own 38. They elected to go for it, and Theilen ran it 41 yards for a first down all the way to the Green Bay 21. Bridgewater was then sacked by Clinton Dix, and the Vikings would end up having to settle for a 39-yard field goal attempt a few plays later. Blair Walsh put it through the uprights, and it was now 3-0 Minnesota over Green Bay with just under 11 minutes still left in the first quarter. So now the Packers would take over, and they would put together a pretty impressive drive lasting nearly 9 minutes. And it started off on the Green Bay 20 after the touchback on the kickoff, and they would drive the ball up towards midfield, and they would have a 4th and 1 situation on their own 41. They would go for it as well. Eddie Lacy picked up 2 yards, and it was a first down at the Green Bay 43. Then on 2nd and 4 from the 49, Aaron Rodgers went to Richard Rodgers. He picked up 18 and a first down at the Minnesota 33. They were then faced with a 3rd and 1 at the 24, and James Starks ran it 5 yards for the first down into the red zone at the Minnesota 19-yard line. Their drive would stall at the 10, and out would come Mason Crosby to attempt a 28-yard field goal. It was up, it was good, and this game was tied at 3 apiece with about 2 minutes left still in the first quarter. The Vikings would be held to a 3-and-out on their second possession of the game, and they would punt the ball to Green Bay, who would take over on their own 16 and bring the first quarter to a close. But their drive would end up stalling when on 3rd and 8 from the 29, Aaron Rodgers was sacked by Johnson and Harrison Smith, and so out came the punting unit after 5 plays on the possession. So now Minnesota would take over, but they would end up punting the ball back to the Pack after 6 plays. Green Bay then went 3-and-out as the Vikings defense held them and forced them to punt, and now Minnesota would take over on their own 43. So set up right there with good field position. They wouldn't waste much time getting into Green Bay territory and down into the red zone. But on 3rd and 8 from the 9, Bridgewater was sacked by Clay Matthews, and out would come Blair Walsh to attempt his second field goal of the game, this one from 32 yards out. It was up, it was good, and now the Vikings were back in the lead by 3 with the score Minnesota 6, Green Bay 3, with just under 3 minutes left before halftime. So now the Packers would take over after the touchback on the kickoff on their own 20, and they moved the ball up towards midfield as they had on 1st and 10 from the 20. Rodgers went to Davante Adams for a 24-yard reception to bring it up to the 44, but then they lost a yard going into the 2-minute warning. So coming out of the 2-minute warning was 2nd and 11 at the 43, and a penalty against the Vikings for pass interference brought the Packers into Minnesota territory. But then after losing a yard on a 3rd and 4, they would be faced with a 4th and 5 from the Minnesota 40. They would go for it, and an incomplete pass would turn the ball over on downs with less than a minute left before halftime. Minnesota would take over, and they would end up punting after 5 plays, and Green Bay actually got the ball back before the half and took a knee to bring the game to the intermission. So 6-3 at halftime, and the Packers would get the ball first in the second half, but the Vikings would hold them to a 3-and-out, and they would get the ball on their own 42 after the punt. They wasted little time getting into Green Bay territory, and on a 1st and 10 from the 37, Theilen ran 26 yards for a first down in the red zone at the Packers' 11-yard line. Peterson then picked up 5 yards and another 3 yards to make it 3rd and 2 on the 3, and Adrian Peterson scored on a 3-yard touchdown run. Blair Walsh added the extra point, and it was now 13-3 as the Vikings led by 10 with 10.5 minutes still left in the third. The Vikings defense held the Packers to a second consecutive 3-and-out here in the second half, and now they would take over on their own 23 after the punt, but they would end up faced with a 3rd and 5 on their own 39, and Teddy Bridgewater was intercepted by Micah Hyde. And so now Green Bay would take over after the interception in Minnesota territory at the 43, and they would get down to the 35, a 3rd and 2, but a penalty for holding would push them back to the Minnesota 45 for a 3rd and 12, and on 3rd and 12, Rodgers going back to pass, and his arm is hit while he was in the motion, and it is ruled a fumble. Captain Munnerlyn scoops it up and runs it back 55 yards for the touchdown, and with the extra point by Blair Walsh, it was 20-3, Vikings ahead of the Packers as they extended their lead to 17. And they reviewed the play, they looked at it, and they ruled that it was a fumble, although a lot of these calls I find to be kind of questionable, but we all know that that's how it is after the Tuck rule so many moons ago. But now the Green Bay Packers would take over after the touchback on the kickoff after the score, now down by 3 scores, and they would move down the field and they would get into Minnesota territory with a big play from Aaron Rodgers to James Jones on a 2nd and 18 from the 28. It was a 32-yard reception that brought the ball up to midfield at the 43. They were then faced with a 4th and 4 at the Minnesota 37. They elected to go for it down by 17, and Rodgers hit Randall Cobb, and he ended up getting the first down with a 4-yard gain on the reception to make it a first down at the Minnesota 33. They would bring the third quarter to a close 2 plays later, and they opened up the fourth quarter with a 3rd and 3 at the Minnesota 26. Rodgers scrambles for 11 yards in the first down in the red zone at the 15, but on the next play, he was sacked by Barr, Anthony Barr with the sack, and now it was 2nd and 11 at the Minnesota 16. Rodgers bounces back, and he hits Richard Rodgers for a 16-yard touchdown. Mason Crosby adds the extra point, and it was now a 10-point game with the score of Minnesota 20, Green Bay 10, with 13.5 minutes left to play in this game. So now the Vikings would take over, and after 6 plays, they would end up punting the ball back to the Pack. Green Bay would take over on their own 16-yard line after the punt, and on a 2nd and 4 from the 39, after picking up a first down, Aaron Rodgers hit James Jones this time for a 25-yard reception to bring the ball to the Minnesota 36. They picked up another first down, but then on 3rd and 3 from the 18, Aaron Rodgers was sacked by Everson Griffin, and so Mason Crosby came out to attempt a 43-yard field goal. It was up, it was good, and it was now a 1-score game with the score 20-13, Minnesota up by 7. So now Green Bay would kick off, and Cordarrelle Patterson runs it back 70 yards, but wait a minute, Mason Crosby comes up and strips Patterson. Who's been teaching Mason Crosby to strip the ball? Micah Hyde jumps on it, and now Green Bay has the ball. What an incredible play by Mason Crosby. Who knew he had been practicing how to strip the ball? But he makes a huge play on special teams, and now Green Bay had the ball on their own 23, down by 7 with 5.5 left on the clock. They would move the ball up towards midfield when Rodgers hit Randall Cobb for a 17-yard reception to make it a first down at the 40. Rodgers then went to James Jones. He picked up 37, and now it was a first down in Minnesota territory at the 23. An incomplete pass brought up 2nd down, and Rodgers went to Kuhn. John Kuhn picked up 13 yards, and now it was a first down in the red zone at the Minnesota 10. So then on 2nd down, Rodgers was sacked by Sharif Floyd, and that made it 3rd and goal at the 13. An incomplete pass would bring up 4th down, and now with less than 2.5 minutes left in the game, but still on the other side of the 2-minute warning with about 2:20 on the clock, Green Bay actually was forced to use their second timeout of the second half, as they were not quite prepared for the situation. They should have already known they were in 4-down territory, but instead they got kind of confused on the incomplete pass, and they had to take a timeout. So bad clock management by the Packers. They had kept the timeout. They could have just kicked a field goal, had 2 timeouts and the 2-minute warning to stop the clock, but instead they elect to go for it on 4th down, and Aaron Rodgers is intercepted by Xavier Rhodes in the end zone for the touchback. So Minnesota coming up huge on defense. Their defense was big all game long. So now Minnesota would take over, but the Green Bay Packers would force a 3-and-out. The game would go to the 2-minute warning and come out of the 2-minute warning with the Packers taking their last timeout. And on 3rd and 5, Peterson picked up 2, but the clock would keep going, but Minnesota ended up taking a timeout just as they would have gotten a penalty for delay of game, and so they would end up punting the ball with just over a minute left on the clock, and the Green Bay Packers would take over on their own 42. A pair of incomplete passes brought up 3rd down, and a 3rd incomplete pass in a row would make it 4th and 10, still at the 42, and Aaron Rodgers goes to Richard Rodgers. He picks up 12 yards in the first down at the Minnesota 46. Rodgers then goes to Devontae Adams. He picks up 7 yards, and then on 2nd and 3, an incomplete pass, and now I think they spiked, but so an incomplete pass. Rodgers then went to Rodgers. He picked up a yard, and now it was 4th and 2, and they rushed up to the line. They didn't have time to stop it. It would have been a turnover on downs if he had spiked it, because it was now 4th and 2 at the 38. They rushed up somehow, some way. They were able to get a snap off, but it would all be for naught as Anthony Barr breaks up the pass to Jones, and this game came to a close. And the Minnesota Vikings hold on to win in dramatic fashion with the final score 20-13. Minnesota takes the NFC North Division Championship with a record of 11-5. They're 5-3 on the road, 6-2 at home, and they will be hosting a game in the wild card round, as they're going to be hosting the Seattle Seahawks. The Green Bay Packers finished the season with a record of 10-6, 5-3 at home in Lambeau Field, and they're going to be going on the road to Washington to face the Redskins in the wild card round. So what a crazy finish to this game. I'll tell you, the Packers, it was an interesting game. They were just getting their butts kicked the whole time. Even though the Vikings weren't really doing a lot on offense, their defense was shutting down Green Bay, and then they came up with that huge play with that 55-yard fumble return. A little bit questionable as to whether it was a fumble or not, but they ruled it was, and they scored that touchdown, and the defense was coming up big for the Vikings. They said not a lot of yards, not a lot of production out of the offense, but they were keeping Green Bay off the scoreboard. And then you had that big play with Cordarrelle Patterson running it back 70 yards, but then Mason Crosby stripping the ball, and all of a sudden, all the energy, the momentum shifted. It seemed as if the Packers were going to come back and win this game, but then bad clock management, bad play calling by the Green Bay Packers. And I'll tell you, I personally, this is just me, while watching it, I was like, why aren't they going for the field goal? They need the field goal. And with the 2 timeouts and the 2-minute warning, the way their defense has been playing, they will get the ball back. And they did get the ball back. And then they would have still had some momentum, because they would have got the 3 points. And then they get the ball back, still needing a touchdown, but now it's for the win, not just for the tie. Going for it on 4th down there, it's playing for the tie. You're saying, like, no, we're not going to be able to win this game. Let's just try to tie it up. Instead, you could get the 3, but what do? They burn a timeout, they waste the timeout, instead just lining up for the field goal, and then they have the interception, which was even worse than not coming, even the fact that he didn't come up with any points, but to have the interception, that really just took the life out of the building. It really took the momentum away from the Packers. At least with the 3, they would have still had momentum on their side. They could have stopped the clock and got the ball back. They would have had the ball back with about a minute and a half on the clock, which is more than enough time for Aaron Rodgers. We've seen before. I mean, the Packers only need like a few seconds to score, really. I mean, we saw that game with Detroit with that Hail Mary, but that really screwed up their momentum, their mojo. I mean, I guess how much stock do you really put into that? You can choose yourself or leave a comment below to say if that's just bogus and doesn't even matter. But I think momentum matters in this game, but they had it right there in their grasp. But really, the Vikings coming up huge. Rhodes with that interception. You cannot emphasize that enough, how well the Vikings defense played and how good the Vikings defense has been playing all year long. The Vikings defense is the reason why they won the NFC North and why they are hosting a playoff game in the wild card round. But let's look at the stats in this game. Case in point, Teddy Bridgewater in this game was just 10 of 19 for 99 yards passing, no touchdowns, and an interception. Adrian Peterson, 19 carries for just 67 yards. He did have a touchdown, though. Theilen had 2 carries for 67 yards as well, as he was just, whenever they gave him the ball, he just had a huge run. But McKinnon was the leading receiver for the Vikings, their running back. He had 3 receptions for 33 yards. He also had 4 carries for 15 yards, which gave him 48 total yards in the game. Mike Wallace had just 1 catch for 22 yards. Wright had just 2 catches for 21 yards. And Theilen had a catch for 16 yards, as that gave him 83 yards on the game. But for the Packers, Aaron Rodgers, 28 for 44, 291 passing yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Eddie Lacy, just 13 carries for 34 yards. James Starks, just 8 carries for 24 yards, as they were struggling as well. James Jones had 4 receptions for 102 yards, and Richard Rodgers, 7 catches for 59 yards and a touchdown. Devontae Adams, 4 catches for 54 yards. Randall Cobb, 6 catches for 37 yards. Starks had 3 catches for 18 yards to go along with his 24 rushing yards, as he ended up with 42 total yards. And John Kuhn had 2 catches for 14 yards and a rush for 3 yards, giving him 17 total yards. Lacey had 2 catches for 7 yards, which gave him 41 total yards on the game. We look at the kickers. Blair Walsh was perfect, 2 for 2 on the field goals, 2 for 2 on the extra points. And Mason Crosby was perfect as well, 2 for 2 on the field goals, 1 for 1 on the extra points. And also, you give him a little bonus for that play he made on special teams, even though it would all be for naught. But we look at the Vikings defense, and Everson Griffith coming up huge, 2 sacks and a forced fumble. Sharif Floyd had a sack as well. Anthony Barr had a sack. Harrison Smith had a half a sack. Johnson had a half a sack. Xavier Rhodes with an interception. And then for the Packers, Clinton Dix had a sack, and Clay Matthews had a sack. Julius Peppers had a sack, and Micah Hyde had an interception. Then we look at the team stats. 19 first downs for the Packers, 14 first downs for the Vikings. On third down, both these teams struggled, as it was all defense in this game. But the Vikings, 2 for 11, just 18% third down conversion. And the Packers also just 2 converted, but out of 15 for a 13% conversion rate on third down. On fourth down, the Vikings went for it once and converted. The Packers went for it 6 times on fourth down. They converted 3, turned the ball over on downs 3 times, 50% on fourth down. Total net yards, 350 for the Packers, 242 for the Vikings. On the ground, the Vikings netted 151. The Packers just 76 yards netted on the ground. Through the air, the Packers netted 274. The Vikings just 91 yards. Aaron Rodgers sacked 5 times, losing a total of 17 yards. Teddy Bridgewater was sacked 3 times, losing a total of 8 yards. We look at the penalties in this game. 7 penalties against the Packers for 54 yards. 5 penalties against the Vikings for 37 yards. The Vikings had 3 fumbles. They recovered 2, and they lost 1. The Packers had 1 fumble, which they did lose. And then we look at the red zone, And the Vikings 1 for 2, 50%. The Packers just 1 for 4, 25%. As they struggled in the red zone. The Vikings came up big time into the red zone, into the dead zone. And the Packers ended up with 35 minutes and 42 seconds of possession on the game clock. And the Vikings just 24 minutes and 18 seconds. So it was all about the defense of Minnesota. They came up with a huge clutch performance on the road. That had been a big question mark for Minnesota, was whether their defense could travel, and they've shown it time and time again, actually, as they end up above 500 on the season on the road with a record of 5-3 on the road, and this was their biggest road victory in terms of their defensive performance. Like I said, they've shown already in those other 5 wins they could win on the road and their defense could travel, but that was the question heading into the season, as they've been playing really good defense at home last year and all year this year. But it was a question, especially after the first half of the season, would they be able to travel and come up with the big performances that they did at home on the defensive end? And they showed and proved in this game. Their defense came up big time for Minnesota in a game that the Packers had chances to win it, but every time they were knocking on the door, the defense of the Minnesota Vikings shut that door and slammed it in their face, and they take the division. And you wonder, though, what for, in a way. I mean, it's good. You definitely want to win your division. You want to go into the playoffs with a win, but now they face the Seahawks. And you got to wonder, it's like picking your poison. Would you rather host the Seahawks or go to Washington to face the Redskins? And the Redskins are a tough team in D.C. They're a tough team to beat, to have to go into their home. And then the Seahawks, though, look at what they just did in Arizona. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword right there. But you want to win your division, and that's a huge thing for the Vikings to actually get over that hump, to take the division title away from the Packers, and to be able to raise that banner. And especially, they're going to have the new stadium. They'll be able to raise the banner in that new stadium. But they got at least one more game there at the University of Minnesota. It's going to be cold. It's going to be outside. I wouldn't be surprised if we see snow during this game. But the Seahawks, they're used to cold weather too. They play outdoors as well. So it'll be definitely an interesting game to watch. But this game right here, the Packers, the way they played, really didn't deserve to win. It was crazy that they were actually, came down to the final play with a chance to send it into overtime. But that's the Packers for you. No matter how bad they play, Aaron Rodgers is such a high caliber of quarterback that he always has you within one throw of winning or tying the game. Whenever you got Aaron Rodgers under center, anything can happen. And we saw before when the Packers won the Super Bowl, back 2010, that they were able, they were a wild card team when they beat the Steelers in that Super Bowl. So you never know what could happen. But the Vikings, like I said, this could be their year too. They won the division, but now they're going to have to face the defending NFC champions with the Seahawks coming to town in Wild Card Week. But let me know what you think in the comments section below. We'll talk a lot more about the playoffs in the days to come leading up to next week. But thank you very much for listening. It is greatly appreciated. I hope you're having a good day and having a great weekend, and enjoy all the sports.